Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Russell, how are you? I'm very well.
Great. It's really good to see you today. Thanks for joining us. I thought I'd start by asking you, how did you get into the field of ecclesiastical law?
I read law in Jesus College in Oxford as an undergraduate, and after about a term there, I got in touch with my bishop back in Ireland to see about going forward for ordination. And so I went from law undergraduate to theology undergraduate to curate, and now I've been in this parish in my first incumbency for about 9 years. And after about a year as incumbent here, I realized that I missed the law. And I looked around for ways in which I could scratch that particular itch. And I found the LLM in canon law in Cardiff, which I have to say turned out to be a glorious experience. Uh, I think all of us would say we owe a debt of gratitude to Norman Doe for sparking a particular interest, but also the canon law LLM is a springboard to doing other things. And I would say that the field of canon law in these islands, at least within Anglicanism, is one of the most open areas for new people and for younger people to get involved and to take part and to be encouraged. And that is largely down to Norman and to people like Mark Hill, who will draw others in. They are not precious and they're quite keen to get others to take their place. I know we've both been involved with the Anglican Roman Catholic canon lawyers, and that's probably a good example of that as well. But just after I put in my application for the LLM, I got approached by the Archbishop in Dublin to ask if I would become the Registrar of the Diocese and the Province. And he asked me if I'd like time to think, and I tried to look like I was thinking about it, but I very quickly wanted to say yes. And that has been my role since. And with that comes I'm the secretary of the Episcopal Electoral Colleges in the Southern Province, and rather delightfully, the clerk of the Court of the General Synod, though the Court of the General Synod has not sat during my time, which is a mixed blessing and probably for the best.
Sure. No, that's fascinating, Stephen. So, what other duties attach themselves to your roles as registrars of the province and of the diocese?
Well, I think at disestablishment, most of the diocesan structures were really kept as close to what had existed previously as was possible. So an Irish registrar is vaguely similar to an English registrar, I suppose, on a smaller scale. The law is no longer the law of the land, it's very much private, but faculty matters take up quite a lot of time. Matters pertaining to matrimony did take up a lot of time until the law here was changed, and now most responsibility rests with the couple and with the priest who will marry them. And the idea of general licenses and special licenses no longer take up the time of the registrar, I am very pleased to say.
Great. No, that's really interesting to hear. So you're, as you say, a priest, busy, active parish, your priestly ministry. You've also got your academic interest in canon law, and obviously this very practical day-by-day work as a registrar. How do you feel that those roles come together? Does as a canonist and as a priest, do you find that the two work together well?
I do. I mean, one of the things I like to think about on occasion is really about the vocation of the canonist. I think we're quite used with priests talking about a priestly vocation. And certainly I would see my vocation as a canonist to be every bit as strong as my priestly vocation, or perhaps better expressed, I would see them both as part of the one vocation. I think people are used to clergy having a vocation to pastoral care, to spreading the word, whereas we think of ecclesiastical lawyers as people who deal in rather dry bones and in regulation and in stifling that wonderfully creative idea you've just had that you think would be, the next greatest thing. But to start to think about the vocation of the canonist, we have to start to think about the question of authority, which is where you quite quickly can lose some people. But the church as a community has to be able to make sense of itself. And it's not just a human community, it's a community that sees at its heart and as the reason for its existence, the continued action of God. And so to be able to make sense of that, to set parameters for that, so the community can say, well, yes, we will accept this, but no, that is something we simply will not own. You have to be able to talk God and to talk rules or regulation or law. And you have to be able to talk both of those things and see them as part of the one endeavor. It's something that I think we see expressed sometimes in the legal instruments of other communions quite well. I'm thinking of CIC 1752, the supreme law of the church is the salvation of souls. It's not something you see in Anglican formularies quite so often, though the principles document does talk about the law existing to further the mission of the church and its witness to Jesus Christ. So I think we as canonists have a vocation to the people of God to make sure that they are not subject to arbitrary power, but that when they approach one another, when they approach the church, they can be relatively confident that if the facts are X, well, then the standard outcome will be Y. And that there will be nothing unexpected. And also for the church as a decision-making body, and for clergy and others who have to make decisions, that they know if approached with facts which are X, they can make the decision Y. And really that frees the church up from a lot of indecision, from a lot of strife, to be able to go out and to further its mission. So I think the vocation of a canonist is really to free the church up to do the work of the church and to fulfill its mission. Or at least that's the way I like to tell myself it functions.
Absolutely.
Others may disagree.
Of course, but I find that really, really fascinating, Steve. And I think when you draw on that principle about law furthering the mission of the church, that that is the work of the people of God, and for priests to lead that, isn't it? The mission of the church, and law. I think it's right for it to be seen as something enabling. We've got something we want to do, put this church field to a particular use, one thing in my mind as I look out my window, for example, and we do that through the operation of law, which enables things to be done. And but as I think absolutely crucial, as you say, isn't it, that it's not arbitrary. It's not that I'm the king in the castle or the bishop, but that the whole community has its say in an ordered way. I think I hope it's not going too far to say that. I think to take canon law seriously requires people in a position of leadership to have a certain humility, because we say it's not primarily down to me, it's primarily down to the law, and each of us has a place and has an opportunity to have our say, and then the decision will be made in a fair way. Does that sort of chime with your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think what's central to that, of course, is that the canonist has to recognize that they are bound by the same rules that they help other people to apply. So no one is above the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you find when you speak to others, do you find a tension in other people's approach? Do they think it odd to find parish priest who is also very much a practicing ecclesiastical lawyer?
I think you have to remember, in Ireland, the Anglican Church is very much in it's a small minority. It's less than 10% of the population. And the majority tradition, the Catholic Church, has a much longer tradition of priest canonists. So in our local setting here, it is not odd. Within the Anglican Church, certainly the Anglican Church in Ireland, it is a little bit more unusual. I think when we were disestablished, we took a general synod and a legal system based on Parliament at Westminster, because, well, what could be water if you were starting with a clean sheet of paper? So that has always been, since disestablishment at least, in the hands of civil lawyers, in the common law tradition, solicitors, barristers, and we've been very well served by them. But when you look at the works that predate disestablishment, the clergy were much more actively involved. And I think there's nothing wrong with the role of good lay people in the administration of ecclesiastical law. But I think it's something in which clergy should become more interested and see it as not being tangential to their work, but actually something quite important in their work. But I've never found anyone expressing the view that I oughtn't to do this or that it's a very strange thing to do. I think most people in the parish realize it's just one of my little quirks. They're happy enough to let me get on with it. I don't, I suppose, spend all that much time in the diocese doing registrarial things. I'm very well blessed with a very good deputy registrar as well, and the diocesan administration takes a lot of the burden too.
Sure. No, that's interesting. So, from what you've been saying, those who are perhaps familiar with the Church of England's system of ecclesiastical law, or perhaps to a lesser extent other parts of the Anglican Communion, they'd find a lot of what's familiar in your church. You mentioned registrars already, things like the faculty jurisdiction and so on. Do you feel that the law's playing an increasing area in the role in the life of the church in some areas at the moment?
It's a very interesting question. It's a very good question. I think there is a certain amount of antinomianism, right, which is unfortunate, and it's being combated. And actually, one of the people who's combated it for quite a long time is the Bishop of Cork, Paul Coulton, who did the LLM with Norman at one point and then did a PhD with Norman also. And he's been quite instrumental in getting more clergy interested in the law, and also evaluating or elevating the place of law within the discourse of the church. But still, I would say that we have a slightly, not underdeveloped, but underused court system. And I think there is a tendency that in the church, people would shy away from doing things through the appointed legal channels. And what steps into that vacuum, of course, is always, or largely, executive action. And to me, that's quite a negative development. It's quite often episcopal power that steps in there. And in a small community like ours, I can understand that people don't want dirty linen aired in public or don't want their business known. But light and air are very good things in the decision-making process, and decisions that are made in an administrative way, quietly, privately, are not always the best decisions, or at least they're not the best way of making decisions. So I do like to see due process. I think in the church we're getting a better understanding of that. We have had some significant reforms over the last decade to change the way in which we do things. One of the main ones being we changed the system for clergy discipline. Everything used to be a trial before the Court of the General Synod, which was made up largely of judges from both political jurisdictions sitting alongside bishops, a glorious system for working out any dispute, as you'd undoubtedly agree. And that has been changed to something a little bit more modern. There's still good due process, but it's based on a more, I suppose, a slightly more modern and more familiar dispute reconciliation process.
Sure. Well, that's really interesting to hear. I think in the Ecclesiastical Law Society, we think the solution to some of those potential ills that you outline is good education in ecclesiastical law. That's what this society is all about, and all the different ways in which we try and further education. I wonder, in Ireland, in your church, Stephen, is there much in the way of education in canon law for clergy, for lay officers, ordinands?
Not an awful lot. Certainly when I went through college, I received none. I think towards the end of our time, the principal of the college, who had been a parish priest for a long time, sat us all down and told us, look, you will have to do things like chair meetings of a select vestry, and you ought to really get yourselves a copy of the Constitution, and you ought to read it. It didn't go much beyond that, sort of encouraging us to go off and look at these things. I know that different dioceses have taken different approaches to this. Again, the Bishop of Cork has actually had Professor Doe over to speak to his clergy at a clergy conference about the importance of ecclesiastical law. The training system for clergy here is slightly different than in many places. It is a 4 years master's course for full-time students. You do 3 years in the college. You are then ordained deacon, and you spend a year largely in a parish, but also writing a dissertation. And you come back into the college several times during that year for some extra modules. And one of the extra modules is ecclesiastical law. Which I teach. So I do get a chance to talk to people about ecclesiastical law. It's quite a good time to talk to them because they've had a while in their parishes and they've had the experience of the email that comes in or the message on the answering phone. And I must say, I have borrowed, by which I mean I have shamelessly stolen, Will Adams' idea in his book for teaching ecclesiastical law to the newly ordained, to go through possible messages that might come in on any given day, to go through the legal texts, to see how you might answer it yourself. And if you can't work out the answer, to see where you might go for some help. I know since Bishop Colton did the LLM, several other clergy have done the LLM, and it's certainly something I would encourage people to do. And I also go around banging a drum for the ELS where possible.
Wonderful. Well, that's great to hear, Stephen. And I really like that, that teaching method you outline as well. That seems really interesting and a really good way of engaging curates who perhaps wouldn't otherwise be bounding up to the ecclesiastical law lecturer thinking that this is the most important thing for me to learn today, really focusing in on the problems that, as you say, could come in through the letterbox, email, on the phone at any moment. And if they don't know the answer, at least they need to know who to turn to find it.
And I think they may not have bounded up whilst in Ordinand, but there's nothing like being in a parish and you're training an incumbent doing the traditional thing of going on holiday as soon as you're appointed. And you realize that the buck has to stop somewhere, and it can feel quite weighty if you think it's stopping with you and there's no one around who might advise. But of course, as we know, there are always people around who will help and who will assist. And people involved in ecclesiastical law are, to the last man and woman, entirely friendly and approachable. And yes.
Absolutely. Well, I can certainly vouch for that. And it's great to hear, Stephen, that you're flying the flag for education in ecclesiastical law along with all the other things.
That might be to overstate the case, Father. Now,
Brilliant. Well, thanks for talking to us today. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure.
Good to see you and catch up with you again soon.
Absolutely. Take care.